So, welcome to my Philosophy Compass series. To those of you who don't know, Philosophy Compass is a journal publishing peer-reviewed survey articles of the most important research in and current thinking from philosophy. In this series, I summarize, explicate, and often expound upon the contents of the Philosophy Compass articles. I have my own outline, and talking points, and so while I give a faithful summary of the article, I certainly won't be merely reading the papers to you, the Philosophy Compass papers to you. And so today I'll be covering Chad McIntosh's article on non-traditional arguments for theism. And as much as I love tradition, it's time to explore some fascinating theistic arguments not based on the traditional categories: cosmological, ontological, design, moral, miracle-based, pragmatic, and experiential arguments. Those are sort of the traditional categories. So let's dig in. His taxonomy for arguments includes 7 broad kinds of arguments, and I'll cover each of these in turn. So the first one is metaphysical, the second one is nonological, the third is axiological, then noological, then linguistic, then anthropological, and finally a sort of meta-argument. Okay, so Section 1 deals with metaphysical arguments. So these are arguments based on certain metaphysical entities and facts. McIntosh gives 7 of these sort of non-traditional arguments, and again, he's kind of surveying the literature here. So the first kind of argument stems from abstracta generally. So abstract objects are things like properties, relations, propositions, numbers, sets, logical laws, and so on. So some arguments along these lines, namely from abstracta more generally, proceed by eliminative inference. That is to say, we're eliminating the alternatives, alternative explanatory accounts of something, to leave one victor, and hence one true account of them. So along these lines, Feser's Augustinian proof is one of these kinds of arguments. So Feser, for instance, infers theism by eliminating the only other realist accounts on offer with respect to abstracta, namely Platonism and Aristotelian realism, or sort of moderate realism. So Platonism locates abstracta in some sort of epistemically inaccessible realm distinct from the mental and physical, and due to its epistemic inaccessibility, so argues Feser, and of course he brings to light other arguments and considerations against Platonism, we should reject Platonism. On the flip side, we also eliminate Aristotelian or moderate realism on the basis of its failure to account for the necessity and infinitude of abstracta. We need some sort of other account. But we've already eliminated Platonism, we don't have moderate realism, and he rules out nominalism. So, what do we have left? Well, it seems as though theism can solve this problem by locating abstracta in a necessarily existent infinite intellect. And so it's a sort of eliminative inference. Now, by contrast, E.J. Lowe argues that God is the best explanation of abstracta's existence. So Feser is trying to say, like, oh, well, we have to arrive at God because he's, like, the only possible thing that could explain it, and hence he's necessary to explain it. But E.J. Lowe argues that God's the best explanation. So he's not saying that God's the only explanation, but he argues at least that God's the best explanation of abstracta's existence. Now, recall that abstracta are non-physical, infinite in number, and necessary. Now, the reason they're non-physical, well, there are a number of reasons, but one reason is just that abstracta are sort of multiply instantiable. That is to say, they can be present in multiple things at the same time. Whereas it's quite difficult to see how a material object or material thing could be such that it is shared by multiple distinct material things, right? That doesn't seem to be possible. How, for instance, like this particular bottle, as a particular concrete object, it seems as though it couldn't be a sort of abstract object that is shared among discrete, numerically non-identical, that is to say numerically distinct, physical objects. So it seems to be the case that abstracta can't be physical objects, in which case they seem to be non-physical. And they're also infinite in number, right? There are an infinite number of primes, there are an infinite number of natural numbers and real numbers. And they also seem to be necessary. So certain abstract principles and truths, like the Pythagorean theorem with respect to Euclidean triangles, that seems to just be a necessary truth, and hence abstracta seem, at least a good number of them, to be necessarily existent. But then it seems as though we can't explain why abstracta exist by anything physical, finite, or contingent. And, so then it seems as though we need some sort of non-physical, infinite, and necessary thing to explain them, lest we get sort of brute, inexplicable, phenomenon, namely the existence of abstracta, within our ontology. And so theism seems to unite in one fell swoop all of the desiderata concerning abstracta, namely a non-physical, infinite, necessary intellect that can serve to ground them. Now, there are a number of different problems for these sorts of arguments to divine conceptualism on the basis of abstracta generally. So first of all, it seems to me that they seem quite flatly incompatible with absolute divine simplicity. So absolute divine simplicity says that there's no multiplicity within God. God does not have any parts. He doesn't have any distinct properties. All of his properties and attributes are such that they're not only identical with one another, but also to God himself and his essence and his existence as well. And so it seems to me to be the case that this divine conceptualism does not jibe well with absolute divine simplicity. Well, why is that? Well, it's because what we're trying to do is we're trying to ground the existence of really distinct abstracta. And so what we need, if we're trying to ground them in a necessary intellect, we're going to have real multiplicity within this necessary intellect if we want to ground the real multiplicity of the abstracta themselves. So for instance, you can take the proposition, there are numbers, and the proposition, there are dogs. Now, these two propositions are really distinct. One of them, for instance, has the property of being necessarily true, whereas the other one has the property of being contingently true. And one of them, used to be false when there weren't dogs, namely prior to evolutionary history. So, there was a point at which one was false and one was true. So these are quite clearly distinct things. So it seems if we're locating these within a divine intellect, well then if we're sort of just collapsing them into one thing, then we haven't really grounded the existence of the abstracta themselves. We've actually grounded the existence of something else. So there's still, like a triangle is really distinct from a circle, and a circle is really distinct from a proposition, and a proposition is really distinct from a property. If we truly want to have a satisfactory ground of these, and if we want to identify them with something intrinsic to God, say God's thoughts, and if these things are really distinct, well then it seems as though we have to have real distinction within God, and that's not compatible with absolute divine simplicity. So it seems as though we're not going to be able to take that route. I mean, we could have an alternate conception of God in this, but it seems as though we're not going to be able to have absolute divine simplicity with this. A second problem for divine conceptualism is that it seems to relocate the epistemic access problem. So recall that the epistemic access problem is the problem that I mentioned for Platonism. Platonism seems to locate these abstracta in a sort of epistemically inaccessible realm, right? And it seems that the epistemic access problem equally plagues a sort of theistic account, right? So it seems as though theism relocates the epistemic access problem. Abstracta are still going to be acausal or non-causal, even if they exist in a divine nature, in the divine intellect, or they're grounded in it. But then the question still just re-arises just on another level, right? How does God have access to them, right? If it's a problem for us to get access to them precisely because we don't stand in some sort of causal relation to them, right? They're in this epistemically inaccessible realm of forms or what have you. It seems as though, precisely in virtue of their non-causal nature, I mean, how does God have this sort of epistemic access to them? There's still that puzzle there, and we need some sort of worked out account as to how we could solve that problem. Otherwise, the same objection to Platonism is going to plague this account, namely the epistemic access problem just pushed back a step. So a third problem for divine conceptualism is the problem of multiple instantiability. So the thing is, divine thoughts, if we are identifying propositions and other universals and abstracta with divine thoughts, well then we get this puzzle, right? Abstracta are supposed to play the explanatory role of being multiply instantiable. That is to say, they are instantiated, or they are participated in, or they are present in, or they exist in, or they inhere in a bunch of really distinct concrete things, particular things in the world. So for instance, the property of blackness, for instance, is instantiated by this water bottle, along with my shirt. And so it seems as though if we identify abstracta with divine thoughts, then we lose this multiple instantiability, because divine thoughts are particular concrete things. Like my thought, for instance, is private, and it's like impossible for you to have my thought, like my exact thought. You may have the same content of my thought, but that's precisely because it's a sort of abstract proposition to which both of our thoughts stand in a relation. And so as apprehensions, they would not be intersubjectively available, right? Thoughts, it doesn't seem to be the case that I could share in God's apprehension of a proposition, right? That's a particular concrete thing within God, his thought. And so it seems as though we lose the multiple instantiability, because particular concrete things are, like, by definition, particular. And so it doesn't seem to be the case that God's thoughts can play the role of abstract objects, precisely because, again, now we're making them to be particular concrete things. So another problem is that if we're sort of particularizing and concretizing these abstracta as divine thoughts, well, then it seems as though we're just going to sort of get the problem of the one over the many just at a higher level now with respect to God's thoughts, because God's thoughts are going to be having a number of different properties in common, like the property of being God's thought, or the property of being a thought, right? And so it seems as though we're just relocating the problem of universals and abstracta just at this one higher level. And, there might even be a sort of bootstrapping worry, right? Because in order for God's thoughts to ground the property of being a thought, right, they would sort of already have to be thoughts in the first place. So it seems as though we're trying to ground the property of being a thought in terms of something that is itself a thought, right? So someone might try to respond to this worry for absolute divine simplicity by saying that, oh, well, these abstracta have a sort of intentional existence. So while there is only absolutely one unified, simple divine thought, this divine thought stands in a variety of different relations, and it's the contents that are really distinct, not God's thought itself. But of course, this just seems to push the problem back a step, right? Now we can just ask, well, what's the ontological status of these contents, right? Either they exist or they don't. If they don't, we just get a sort of nominalism. And if they do, well, then they can't be identical to God's thought, precisely because God only has one thought, but there's a real multiplicity and real distinctions among all these different abstracta. And so then we seem to be forced into a sort of Platonism. So it seems as though either we reject absolute divine simplicity, or if we accept absolute divine simplicity, and we want to have this sort of divine conceptualism, well, then we're going to have either a sort of Platonism or a nominalism. That's what it seems. Another problem that I'm going to mention in passing is the problem of ungodly thoughts. So certain propositions are very, very nasty. I'm going to let your mind run wild with that one. So certain propositions are quite nasty, and if we want to identify propositions, or other abstracta more generally, with God's thoughts, well, then it seems as though God's going to have to be thinking some very nasty things, which I mean, is that a problem for perfect being theism? I mean, like, wouldn't a being that doesn't have such really nasty thoughts be better than a being that does have such nasty thoughts? I don't know. That's something for you to think about. Don't think about it in a nasty manner. Yet another problem. So I've got roughly two more problems. One more problem for divine conceptualism. And again, this is just a sort of overview, right? I'm not giving a sort of systematic critique. I'm just giving sort of brief remarks. This isn't the end of the debate. I'm just outlining these different strategies for responding. So two other problems. Number one, if we are identifying abstracta with God's thoughts, well then, defenders of the Kalam are going to have to accept not only the possibility, but the actuality of actual infinites, right? Because, for instance, there are an infinite number of prime numbers, right? There are an infinite number of, there's a countably infinite number of the naturals, and then the reals, there's an uncountably infinite number, right? So, I mean, it's just infinities all over the place. And so it seems to be the case that God would have to have an actual infinite number of thoughts, in which case, well, not only are there infinite amount of things, but the things are concrete, right, if they're God's thoughts. So that seems to be a difficulty for the Kalam, which attempts to say that an actual infinite is metaphysically impossible, or at least metaphysically impossible in the concrete realm. And then finally, the final objection that I'm just going to raise is that just a bootstrapping worry. So God's existence and grounding power seems to already presuppose the exemplification of various properties. And if it presupposes the exemplification of various properties, then of course it can't sort of ground them or explain them in the first place. So for instance, God already needs to possess the property of being able to create properties in order to create properties, right? You might respond by pointing out that, oh, well, God's thoughts are sort of uncreated and necessary. But maybe now we're going to be getting some worries for God's freedom, right? Like, so, God, I mean, like, what's forcing what's forcing or compelling God to think these things, right? Like he thinks them in all possible worlds. I mean, wouldn't God have a sort of radical sovereignty over his thoughts? I mean, it does seem weird that God is sort of like metaphysically compulsed to think these thoughts in every possible world. There might be some worries lurking around here with respect to sovereignty and freedom that make this view unattractive. So these aren't devastating, of course. This series is just a sort of informative and instructive presentation of different non-traditional arguments for theism, and I'm just trying to, give different ways that you can evaluate and analyze this first argument that Chad McIntosh gives. So a second argument within this first section that deals with metaphysical arguments derives from the existence and nature of sets, and this has been argued by Christopher Menzel, and he roughly proceeds as follows. So first, there are such things as sets, so it's a sort of realism with respect to sets. But second, they have a nature, which includes at least the following properties. Number one, they're non-self-membered. Number two, they have their members essentially. And number three, they collectively form a sort of iterative structure. But the existence of sets with these distinctive properties is explained by the fact that sets are naturally thought of as products of intellective activity, or at least that's the best explanation of them. Sets seem to be a sort of just a collecting or thinking together, right? But there are far too many sets with far too many members for them to be the product of any finite and limited intellective collecting activity. Only an infinite mind, right, would have the power to collect the vast infinity of sets that exist in the set theoretic universe. So if the best explanation for the existence of sets is a sort of intellective activity that collects them together, and that's sort of like a very actually nominalist thing to say, right? They're going to want to say like, oh, well, sets are sort of just mind dependent, and so we kind of combine the good fruits of realism, namely, we actually can have these sets within our ontology with the sort of mind dependence thesis, and we get that sets are just sort of intellective activities or operations of collecting things together, which best explains their nature and their existence. But there are just too many for a finite intellect to collect them together, and hence there must be an infinite intellect that serves as a sort of explanation of why these sets exist. So one difficulty for this argument is that, we also need to balance simplicity, especially categorical simplicity, and explanatory power. So even if we get sort of benefits along the lines of explanatory power, one might have worries concerning categorical simplicity. Namely, we seem to be introducing a sort of radically different kind of thing within our ontology now, namely an infinite intellect. And so that seems to increase our categorical complexity, which is a theoretical vice. Although it may help us with the sort of explanatory power. There are other difficulties, but we're not going to canvass them now, and we're going to move on to the third argument that McIntosh offers. So, from propositions. This is the third argument within the metaphysical arguments. From propositions. So propositions are non-physical. They are necessary. They sort of necessarily exist out there. They are intentional. That is to say, they are about things. So the proposition that there are dogs is about dogs. They're also bearers of truth or falsity, right? So the proposition that there are dogs is true. It has a truth value, namely true, and other propositions are false. And they're also infinite in number, right? So you can have a proposition saying 1 plus n equals z, or whatever, for any n, and there are going to be infinitely many of those, right? So that now we have infinite propositions. And all of these seem mysteriously hallmarks of divine intellect thoughts, right? I mean, non-physical? Yeah. Necessary? Yeah. Intentional? About things? Aboutness is the hallmark of the mental. Bearers of truth or falsity? I mean, like, we often say, like, no, that thought's not correct, or, things along those lines. So we can assimilate that within a sort of divine intellect, and their infinite number. It's precisely because the divine intellect is infinite and, has infinite cognitive power that it could harbor these propositions. So it seems as though propositions could be best explained by a divine intellect. It's a rather simple account that unifies all these different aspects of propositions into one coherent account, by contrast to other accounts which have these sort of disparate aspects not unified into a single, simple, explanatory whole. Also, the constituents of propositions might be best understood as ideas. For instance, the idea of dogs and the idea of existing, right? And so a mind would not only be able to host them, but properly arrange them so as to accurately represent reality. Even the most prominent naturalistic accounts of propositions are conceptualist, but fall prey to a scarcity problem. There are more propositions than any theory committed only to finite minds can account for. So it sort of takes the conceptualist account of propositions, and it says, look, we have this scarcity problem, but we do have the benefits of this conceptualist account of propositions, namely we avoid the sort of weird Platonism, or spooky Platonism, and we can just take a sort of divine conceptualist account. And really what drives this sort of argument is just that non-mentally grounded propositions certainly seem spooky. Right? We have these intrinsically representational things existing out there in Plato's realm. I mean, seriously? I mean, it seems more parsimonious and more explanatorily advantageous to locate them all in minds that maintains a sort of categorical uniformity. They're all in minds. And we can ground their intentionality in the intentionality of thought. We also get explanations of their non-physicality, their necessity, their infinitude, and so on. So, I don't know, so the argument goes, it does seem to be very explanatorily advantageous to have a sort of divine explanation of propositions. Okay, so the fifth argument within this category of metaphysical arguments, non-traditional metaphysical arguments, is the argument from limits, which is presented rather forcefully in Josh Rasmussen's book, How Reason Can Lead to God. And if you want to see an interview that I did with Micah Edvinson over at Crusade Against Ignorance, I'll be posting that on this channel at some point in the near future. So a property P is a limit, means that necessarily whatever has P is limited in some positive respect. And so the way the argument goes is that limits are possibly explained, and where we by explanation we mean a non-circular explanation. So an explanation can't presuppose that which it is meant to explain in the first place. Now, what justifies this claim that limits are possibly explained? Well, I mean, first of all, we can certainly conceive an explanation for any particular limit, right? Like we can conceive of something that explains it. For instance, like this water bottle is limited in a variety of respects, right? And, you know, it's certainly conceivable that, you know, something could produce this water bottle and its various limits. So, and given that conceivability is sort of prima facie defeasible evidence for possibility, it seems as though we can say that limits are at least possibly explained. And again, like you can say that, yeah, well, isn't there the conceivability the other direction, right? Like, oh, well, we can conceive that this water bottle doesn't have an explanation. And so we have evidence that it's possible that it doesn't. Sure, I mean, that's compatible with actually limits being possibly explained. All we're saying is that limits are possibly explained. And something can be both possibly explained and possibly not explained. So that's actually compatible with the evidential bearing of conceivability on the principle that limits are possibly explained non-circularly. Another piece of evidence that we can bring to bear for this principle of explanation is that it certainly seems coherent for a limit to be explained, right? So this chair, it's certainly coherent for there to be an explanation of the limits of this chair. There's nothing that seems to contravene reason itself, or there doesn't seem to be anything that engenders incoherence when we say a limit has an explanation. There are lots of other reasons that we can cite in support of this principle, right? So it certainly seems to be the case that, you know, for any limit, it at least could be explained, right? I mean, that just seems kind of intuitive, right? Like, yeah, I mean, you know, what's stopping there from being an explanation, right? So it certainly seems intuitive. So there's that epistemic seeming that provides some sort of prima facie defeasible evidence for it. There's also abduction. So the fact that when we look around us, all sorts of limited things have explanations. What best explains that? Well, perhaps what best explains it is that limits are just the sorts of things that can have explanations. And so it's no surprise that in our experience we see limits that have explanations, right? It'd be strange if, you know, we came across some limit and we just found out that, oh, like, it just couldn't be explained or whatsoever. There's no possible way it could be explained. So perhaps our experience of the world is best explained by this principle of explanation. We can also adduce induction, right? So all around the world, we look at our experience, empirical experience, and every limited thing we've come across is such that not only can it have an explanation, but it does have an explanation, right? So it seems as though we can just do a straightforward induction to justify this. Another reason in support of this is just that for any given fact f, an explanation of f is more probable than none, right? that seems to be just a sort of foundational principle of reason, right? It's presupposed by science and so on and so forth, right? So absent special reasons to think otherwise, there's a sort of defeasible presumption in favor of there being an explanation, or at least, possibly being an explanation, and so that further supports this principle. Another support for this principle comes from categorical uniformity. So all the limits around us, we see that they have a variety of explanations. So, this was produced by a factory. I keep on going back to this, but, boiler up. And so this category of limited things seems to be, at least uniform in our experience, seems to be such that there are explanations of those limits, right? And so if we want to break categorical uniformity and say like, oh, well, yeah, sure, like all these limits in our experience have explanations, but there's this one special one, or like there are these special ones, or this special kind of limits that couldn't have explanations, right? We're breaking categorical uniformity, and these sort of breaks in uniformity, in continuity, modal continuity, or modal uniformity, they seem to add an improbability, right? All else being equal, we would expect a sort of categorical simple uniformity across a given type or category, precisely because it's unified in virtue of being within a category. And so it seems less probable a priori that there would be these sort of seemingly arbitrary breaks in uniformity. So we would need some sort of special reason to think that there's a break in uniformity. And absent such a special reason, there's a sort of defeasible presumption in favor of adhering to this categorical uniformity. And so, again, this is further evidence that limits are categorically uniform with respect to possibly being explained. And finally, we could cite the principle of relevant differences to justify this principle. So it seems to be the case that if you pick any two limits, right, what's going to be a relevant difference between those limits that could account for why one does or can have an explanation, and the other one literally cannot have an explanation, right? Like, what's going to be that difference? I mean, you can't just say, like, oh, well, it's just not possible for this to have an explanation, because it's precisely the question at issue as to why it can't have an explanation, whereas this one does, since they're both limited. Like, what's the relevant difference between the limits here that could account for why one of them literally is impossible for it to have an explanation, and the other one, it's not impossible for it to have an explanation? And, just intuitively, it seems as though we won't be able to pinpoint a sort of relevant difference between limits. And so that's just a further piece of evidence in favor of this principle. But the property having limits is itself a limit, right? Whatever instantiates the property having limits is itself limited precisely because it instantiates that property. It's limited in some positive respect. In which case, whatever has this property, namely the property of having limits, is limited in some positive respect. And that's precisely what we defined limit as, right? So it follows that having limits is itself a limit, and hence, by our principle of explanation, the property of having limits is possibly explained. But the only possible explanation of the property of having limits is an unlimited being, right? You can't cite a limited something that already instantiates the property of having limits to explain why that property is instantiated in the first place. It already presupposes the instantiation of the property, right? If you're trying to explain the instantiation of the property by means of something that already instantiates that property, right? So it's just sort of viciously circular. And so, possibly, there's an unlimited being, right? Because we just found out that the property of having limits is possibly explained, but the only explanation is in terms of an unlimited being, and hence it's possible that there's an unlimited being. But whatever is unlimited is a necessary perfect being, since whatever is less than perfect is limited in some positive respect, right? And so if it's not limited in some positive respect, namely if it's unlimited, it must be perfect, right? So it's going to be a perfect being. And also, whatever is contingent is limited in respect of sort of the robustness of its existence, right? Its grip on reality, its liability to corruption or cessation, right? And that seems to be a sort of limit. In which case, whatever is unlimited is necessary. And so what we get is that it's possible that there is a necessary perfect being, and by the S5 axiom of modal logic, whatever is possibly necessarily the case is just necessarily the case impliciter. It follows that there actually is, and there necessarily is, a necessarily existent perfect being, and this all men call God. So I realized that I was kind of brief on that S5 bit. So something is possible if it obtains, that is to say exists in or is true in, some possible world, okay? Something is necessary if it obtains in all possible worlds. Now, if something is possibly necessary, that just means that something which is of its nature necessarily existent is in some possible world. But, like, by the definition of necessity, right, whatever is necessary obtains in all possible worlds if it obtains in any world, right? If it's the kind of thing which is such that it exists in all possible worlds, and you're saying that this kind of thing is instantiated in one of those possible worlds, well, then we can zoom into that possible world and say, well, hey, hold on a second, how could this necessary thing be instantiated in this world? Well, it's precisely because it's necessary that it must be instantiated in all worlds, right? That's just what its essence is. Its essence couldn't obtain in a particular world if its essence didn't obtain in all worlds. That's just what it means to be necessary. And hence, if something necessary obtains in any world, it obtains in all worlds, including the actual world. And hence, whatever is possibly necessary is necessary simpliciter, and whatever is necessary is, of course, actual. And so we get that whatever is possibly necessary is actually existent. Now, of course, this assumes the symmetry of the accessibility relation, the transitivity of the accessibility relation, and the reflexivity of the accessibility relation. But there are some plausible defenses of S5, and it is the sort of majority view in contemporary modal metaphysics to accept the S5 axioms. Okay, so there are a few problems for this argument, and I'm just going to survey a few. They certainly aren't exhaustive, but one of them is just that, well, it seems entirely possible for there to be necessary unexplained limits. So, for instance, it seems entirely possible that there could, for instance, be just a tiny particle that is such that it has its spatial dimensions and causal powers necessarily. And, there doesn't seem to be any contradiction in that. Or you could imagine a sort of quantum field. And, it could be such that it necessarily exists, and it necessarily has its, limited structure and limited causal powers. There just doesn't seem to be anything incoherent about that. And another thing that we can bring to bear with respect to this objection is that it seems as though this argument from limits might not be compatible with Trinitarianism, right? When we have Trinitarianism, we have three persons, right? Not 4, not 20, not 365, and not 7,512, right? So there is a limit with respect to the number of divine beings, namely 3. But, there just couldn't be other than 3 divine persons if Trinitarianism is true. So it seems as though there's just no explanation as to why there are 3 divine persons as opposed to 2 or 1 or 10 or 365. And if there could be an explanation per our principle of limits, well then it seems as though it couldn't be in terms of those very persons. So it seems as though we'd have to sort of cite some additional God that's accounting for why there is this Trinitarian God, and that's not going to be palatable. Now one might just retort, well, no, it's just necessarily the case that there are 3 persons in the Trinity, and that explains why there are 3 persons. But now there's a difficulty, right? Because now we can just say like, oh, well, hold on a second. Like if you're bringing in these necessary limits with respect to God, the naturalist can bring in necessary limits with respect to the fundamental nature, or the fundamental portion of natural reality, right? It's going to be, for instance, a necessarily existent quantum field. And the quantum field is such that it's going to have its limits obtaining of metaphysical necessity. Why are those limits obtaining? Well, because they're metaphysically necessary, right? So if we're going to cite metaphysical necessity as the explanation of why there's a limited number of Trinitarian persons, well then it seems as though the naturalist is perfectly within his or her epistemic rights to reject this argument by means of pointing to necessarily obtaining limits in the natural foundation of things. So it seems to sort of undercut the step to God. Okay, so a third and final problem stems from desires. So desires seem to come in degrees, right? Like right now, I desire water more than I desire to kick a puppy. Maybe that has a conversational implicature that I actually desire to kick a puppy. I don't desire to kick a puppy. I want to love puppies. I want to kiss them. I want to hug them. And I want to give them all the love in the world. But yeah, I guess I shouldn't have said that. And saying that a being is such that all of its desires are had to an unlimited force or an unlimited strength engenders a lot of problems. So, for instance, we're not going to be able to mount any probabilistic arguments about what this being would do, because when we're mounting such probabilistic arguments, there are going to be a range of different alternatives, each of which has some value to it and hence some desirability to it. But we're going to have to be able to say, oh, well, we would expect at least this outcome more than the others in order to predict what this being would do, or even make sort of Bayesian arguments, like the fine-tuning argument, about what this being would do. But if it's such that all of its desires, even for these incompatible states of affairs, are completely unlimited, well then not only does it seem completely inexplicable as to which one does it choose, if the being is such that it has unlimited desires to bring about all of these, well then it seems as though we're just not going to be able to predict which one we should expect it to bring about, precisely because its desire is such that it is unlimited to bring each one of them about, right? They're all equal in cardinality, namely being beyond cardinality itself, precisely because they're unlimited, right? So it seems as though we're just going to collapse so many different natural theological arguments, because those rely on things that we would expect a perfect being, for instance, to do. And so it seems as though we're going to have to get rid of a lot of natural theological arguments if we have this being which is such that all of its desires are unlimited. I could expound on that further, and I'll probably get to it in a future video, but that suffices for now. So the sixth argument within this metaphysical argument, non-traditional argument scheme, is the applicability of mathematics. So the world is intelligible and rationally investigatable. And also, mathematics is so beautifully and elegantly and a priori surprisingly applicable to reality. You know, it seems suspiciously convenient, right? Why should the realm of material concreta care to act in accordance, with such elegant, universal, abstract mathematical forms or patterns? Just a priori, it seems implausible. But if there is a sort of perfect being, which is such that it loves beautiful things and it has a rational intellect, and mathematics is sort of built into its nature, well then we could expect that such a being would bring about an intelligible and rationally investigatable cosmos. At least the probability of that isn't extremely low, right? Whereas on the supposition that there is no guarantee for that, for instance on the supposition of naturalism, the sheer intelligibility of the world and its being rationally investigatable, and it's the applicability of mathematics to it in such beautiful and elegant and surprising ways for modeling and predicting and carving reality at its joints, it seems vastly improbable just a priori, just sitting back like, okay, under the hypothesis of naturalism, what would we expect? It just seems, like, where is this coming from? Why on earth would reality care about this? Why would natural reality care about any of this? It seems just vastly improbable, especially given all the epistemically possible alternatives that could have obtained, right? And so we could sort of mount a sort of Bayesian argument in favor of theism on the basis of intelligibility and rational investigatability and mathematical applicability to the cosmos. And finally, the seventh metaphysical argument actually stems from anti-realism. So we've been surveying a bunch of different realist ways to derive theism, or attempt to derive theism, but this one actually stems from a sort of mitigated anti-realism. And Brian Leftow actually tries to show, at least, how all abstracta, possible worlds, essences, propositions, hexaeties, I probably pronounced that horribly, but hexaety? Properties, sets, numbers, and relations can be reduced to God and his activities and his thoughts, right? So Leftow thinks that theism outstrips all rival theories of abstracta in theoretical virtues. It's more parsimonious in kind and number, it has greater explanatory scope, it has a more homely and work-efficient primitives, and all without sacrificing what's so attractive about realism, namely objectivity, right? Because God is a sort of robust, metaphysically necessary being that exists in all possible worlds. And, like, Leftow shows how, or at least attempts to show again, how we can sort of reduce all abstracta to God and his activities. So, for instance, essences and essences and properties could be things like divine concepts, and propositions could be things like God's thoughts. Sets could be divine intellective collective activity, so collecting different individuals or elements together. And, possible worlds can be grounded in terms of, either maximally consistent propositions in God's thoughts, or we can combine that with the sort of causal powers of God to sort of initiate different world segments. So we seem to be able to reduce a lot of these different modal properties and abstract properties and modal phenomena, abstract phenomena in God, right? And so that gives a sort of unifying account, very simple, rather than having to postulate, for instance, Lewisian realism or all sorts of different views.